Start. We'll be beginning in 2 minutes now.
Okay.
I request the attendees to come to the front row. Yes, ma'am. In the memory of Professor Varkey, the student body of School of Architecture, CEPT University, annually organizes Kurula Varkey Design Forum. Since its conception in 2001 as a students' forum, it has become a platform for critical discourse on architecture and architectural education. In this event, we invite student projects from more than 200 architecture schools from Asia, from which 15 entries are selected and discussed in the forum. Professor Kurula Varkey was the director of the School of Architecture at CEPT Ahmedabad, now CEPT University, for 15 years, from 1986 to 2001. Varkey and his work played a pivotal role in shaping the architectural education curriculum at CEPT, and many of his pedagogical ideas on architectural education were adopted by the Council of Architecture, New Delhi, to shape the national curricula for colleges of architecture across India. Varkey believed final year design projects at the best schools in the country represent major directions in architecture and deserve a discussion and a review. He envisioned this annual event where we set a standard for much needed critical debate on architectural directions and in the country. On behalf of the student body of Faculty of Architecture at CEPT, Vipasha, Rupal, and I, Ishwarya, welcome everyone to Kurula Varkey Design Forum 2022. This year, the This year, the forum manifests itself as an inquiry to deconstruct our practice as students of design. Are we styling or are we designing? How are are design processes affected by information and capital flow? Can the design process break away from being a template? How linear is the design process? The forum intends to compare processes across architecture schools and practitioners seeking to generate a discussion on the underlying principles of processes. Launching ourselves into this endeavor, we unpack design methods, tools, and sequences, inquiring the possible trajectories and their implications. We invite you to come join this exploration as students to investigate processes of learning. We begin this year's forum with a keynote lecture aiming to open up thinking trajectories of the theme. It discusses the current landscape of the profession and academia and its future learnings. We invite Professor Timothy Ingold for the keynote lecture, followed by his conversation with Professor Neelkanth Chhaya.
Tim Ingold is Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He has carried out fieldwork among Saami and Finnish people in Lapland and has written on environment, technology, and social organization in the circumpolar north, on the animals in human society, and on human ecology and evolutionary theory. His more recent work explores environmental perception and skilled practice. Tim Ingold's current interest lies in the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture. His lecture today is titled Architecture Educates. Without further ado, we now invite Professor Ingold to begin the lecture.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with you today and to start your conference. You can't read a report these days in any sector of science or technology or business management or defense or public policy without being struck by the frequent occurrence of apparently nonsensical strings of capital letters. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see some of these. So here's one example at the top, WMD. Another one is the name of your own university, CEPT. And then there's some more that I'm going to talk about. So with WMD, that is unpronounceable in itself. So you have to spell out the letters. WMD stands for weapons of mass destruction. But others seem to form pronounceable words. So perhaps your university, which started off as a Center for Environmental Planning and Technology, can be pronounced CEPT. And so here C stands for center, E for environment, P for planning, T for technology. Now in this talk, I'm going to be especially concerned with two such words, each of which actually has a counterpart in ordinary language. And these are STEM and STEAM. Now, a STEM is, of course, an ascending axis of vegetative growth, and STEAM is hot vapor. But STEM and STEAM are compactions, in fact, in which each capital letter stands for a longer word that begins with it. So in STEM, it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And with STEAM, you add an A in, so it becomes science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. This last one, shape, is something I'll come to a bit later. So the extra A going from STEM to STEAM stands for art, but it could just as well stand for architecture. Now, these peculiar verbal compactions are what we call acronyms. So whenever we encounter STEM in capital letters, it's here, whenever we encounter STEM, we know it stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And by changing STEM to STEAM, we add art and architecture to the mix. But both of these acronyms are in fact rather recent. STEM was rather rare before the turn of the century, but is now ubiquitous. Everybody uses it. STEAM was coined a few years later, around about 2010, but is rapidly gaining ground. Both acronyms, STEM and STEAM, are most at home in the areas of intersection where educational policy meets research and innovation. And your own acronym, CEPT, Center for Environmental Planning and Technology, as I understand it, dates from around 2005. I think it's rather noteworthy, however, that while the oldest and original parts of your university was its Faculty of Architecture, established in 1962, A for architecture seems to have dropped out of the acronym. Perhaps it will be time to bring it back, turning CEPT into ACCEPT. I don't know. But I want to show that there's rather more to the fashion for acronyms than mere expository convenience, from simply saving all the trouble of having to spell out all these words. I think it's a sign of the instrumentalization of language and the corresponding banishment of affect that accompanies the global expansion of an order of relations in which every conceivable thing carries value as a marketable commodity. And this, of course, is the order of neoliberalism. In the context of educational provision, the most valued commodity is knowledge. Now, under STEM, education in the many disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are harnessed to the relentless demands of the neoliberal economy for knowledge products. Students are regarded as consumers, educators are regarded as service providers delivering products the students wish to acquire. So what in this can art and architecture do? What would happen if you were to add art and architecture to STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as in the transformation from STEM to STEAM? Well, I want to suggest three possible answers. The first is simply to incorporate art and architecture into STEM. The first possible answer is the incorporation of an arts and architecture-based pedagogy into STEM, as in transforming STEM to STEAM or CEPT to ACCEPT. But this merely underlines its market-led objectives. The second possible answer is to emphasize the complementarity between art and architecture on the one hand and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics on the other, while according to each side its own distinctive raison d'etre. The third possibility, however, is to destabilize the entire project of STEM or CEPT, to expose the underlying assumptions, to restore ways of knowing the world to ways of being in it, and to rescue science, technology, engineering, and mathematics from their STEM-induced stultification. And I'm going to argue that only by following this third way can education be turned around by art and by architecture. But let me first get back to acronymics and ask Why are acronyms so attractive to scientists, managers, technocrats, and policymakers? Perhaps the answer is because acronyms allow people like that to identify the matters of their concern without having to speak or spell out their names. After all, when we give voice to words, we actually join our lives with the things of which they tell. We and they go along together in a relation of what I call correspondence. So if you give voice, for example, to the name of a person you know, simply by spelling out this name, by speaking the name, you and this person go along together. You enter into a sort of relationship of affective correspondence. So words, when we speak, when we write, words are ways we have of joining with the world. But acronyms do just the opposite. They cut us off. With acronyms, we can refer to things without having to dwell on them. There's no need for us to mix our lives with theirs. We can turn our backs, feigning indifference and objectivity. In the acronym, there is no trace of affect. We short-circuit names, and by short-circuiting names, we also short-circuit feeling. There's no passion, no recollection, no spectres from the past. So the acronym betokens nothing but sterile, detached instrumentality. So the acronym is an instrument of oversight in both senses. By oversight, we can mean inadvertence, not noticing things, but we can also mean control, controlling things. So the acronym both allows us to neglect things, but also to control them. It allows affairs to be regulated and managed in ways unaffected by personal involvement or responsibility, allowing the research scientist or the technocrat to hide behind a veneer of methodological rigor and professional expertise. Now, this argument also applies, of course, to the names we give to fields of study. Names, after all, matter. Spelled out in full, they're bound up with the lives and identities of practitioners. Suppose I say, I am a philosopher. This is something about myself, about how my ways of thinking and feeling have been shaped by the scholars I have talked to or the works I have studied. And it's much the same for scientists, technologists, and so on. If I say the word science, a whole landscape opens up, a landscape of inquiry stretching as far as the eye can see, ripe for exploration. If I say the word technology, a vista opens up of human undertaking all the way from the handicrafts of our ancestors to today's information technology. If I say the word engineering, I feel I join with Archimedes and Leonardo da Vinci and the great inventors who brought us steam power and aviation, all intent on harnessing the protean forces of nature and putting them to human use. I say the word mathematics and enter an enchanted world of pure form with beauty and a mystique of its own. And to say the word art, or to say the word architecture, and the associations are limitless, encompassing the entire gamut of human ways of making and building from antiquity to the present. Now, over the last several centuries, all these great historical endeavors, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, art, and architecture, have been brought together under the banner of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And this Enlightenment philosophy, dating back some 400 years now, has brought priceless benefits to humanity, millions of people can enjoy longer and more comfortable lives than their ancestors could ever have imagined. Enlightenment humanism has brought us schooling, literacy, and democratic governance. However, STEM and STEAM emerge not so much as the climax of this humanist program, but as pathologies, byproducts of the neoliberal subversion of the Enlightenment's progressive impulse to the logic and interests of global capital. So while there are histories of science, of technology, of mathematics, of engineering, of art and architecture, there is no history of STEM, no history of STEAM, no history even of CEPT. In the name of interdisciplinarity, these acronymic compactions cut across the histories of knowledge, much as internationalism or the international movement cuts across the histories of nations. Having no past, neither STEM nor STEAM opens to a future, or more precisely, its future can only be a target, an end point at which existing models are finally converted into reality, or projections into fact. This is a future incubated in cavernous glass-walled enclosures ranging from research laboratories to corporate headquarters, or even giant domes devoted to the simulation of natural ecosystems, their closely guarded and strictly controlled interiors masquerading as open access, disguising secrecy as transparency. And here, the acronym is like a key code that unlocks the door to the incubator, and only those in possession of the code can enter. Now, the idea of adding A for art, and I take art here broadly, including architecture and design. The idea of adding A for art to STEM, turning it into STEAM, began in the Rhode Island School of Design, the RISD, as it calls itself. The Rhode Island School of Design was founded in 1877 and was one of the first independent colleges of art and design in the United States, and regularly features, even today, as one of the top design schools in the world. And this, in this quotation here, the Rhode Island School of Design describes this initiative to convert STEM into STEAM. I'll just read it out. RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, has long valued the symbiosis between the arts and sciences, weaving cross-disciplinary exploration into various studio practices. In 2010, the college began to champion the addition of art and design to the national agenda of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, education, and to the national agenda of STEM, education, and research, to develop a comprehensive educational model that would better prepare future generations to compete in the 21st century innovation economy. Now, the last line of this quotation, that would better prepare future generations to compete in the 21st century innovation economy. This line clearly places the goals of education within the economic regime of neoliberalism. Art, architecture, and design are to be subordinated to the same instrumental objectives that have already taken hold in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The idea is to bring art, architecture, and design into the frame as ways of thinking, as we say, outside the box, ways of thinking that STEM requires to satisfy its insatiable thirst for innovation. After all, in the marketplace of knowledge, novelty is a condition for competitive advantage. And artists, architects, and designers, known in the trade as creatives, are tasked with coming up with the new ideas that the competition calls for, not just for designing new knowledge products, but also for their advertisement. Art could make them attractive to consumers, especially the young, to whom the sense of wonder is nowadays marketed as a prized commodity. Now, in this way of thinking, creativity and innovation mean much the same thing, coming together in the idea of what it means to be smart. Smart, an idea that has gained extraordinary traction in recent years. It refers to an intelligence that is quick and nimble in solving problems, as well as devious, giving its possessor a competitive edge over his or her more slow-witted rivals. Smart is a hallmark of the successful entrepreneur and is often placed at the top of any list of attributes that a STEM-based education should inculcate in students exposed to it. So the point is to train students to be smart. But surely, you will say, an education in art or architecture or design teaches us more than merely how to be smart. After all, what's the point of succeeding in corporate competition if it yields nothing of intrinsic value? Imagine the billionaire entrepreneur. He's made huge amounts of money. He's come to the top of the tree. And then what? If there's nothing else to civilization, what will be there? If there's nothing of intrinsic value, then what would he use his wealth for? Isn't the point of art to widen our horizons, to open hearts and minds to more fundamental truths? Might art and architecture even restore our faith in the project of enlightenment? Now, various arguments have been proposed along these lines. The most trivial of these arguments reduce art to entertainment, designed to fill the empty hours of affluent leisure. For some, art answers to a yearning for the sublime, for mystery and wonder in a world otherwise so analyzed as to have lost its power to enchant. For others, art is an index of cultural creativity, an acknowledgement of diversity, or a badge of civilization. Perhaps we would recognize the need to complement the detached objectivity, the cold logic and analytical rigor of science with something more subjective, more attuned to feeling, to empathy and holistic understanding. That is claimed is what art is for. And this bifurcation between objectivity and subjectivity, between logic and feeling, between rigor and empathy, between analysis and holistic understanding, this bifurcation is deeply sedimented into the modern constitution. It's even popularly supposed to be wired into the human brain in the division between its left and right hemispheres. Education in art is supposed to help with the development of the right hemisphere, tempering the dominance of the left and offering students a more rounded formation that would enhance their abilities to relate to their surroundings. And yet, this logic of complementarity, while it confers on art an intrinsic merit equal to that of science, does nothing to challenge STEM on its own ground. On the contrary, it reproduces a persistent dualism between affective, embodied experience on the one hand, and the cognitive operations of a disembodied intellect on the other, or between aesthetic judgment and the work of reason, each furnished with its own distinctive style of creativity. Many advocates of the transition from STEM to STEAM see the insertion of the arts as a necessary kind of rebalance, designed to temper the profiteering of the neoliberal project with a human face and a moral conscience. One example of this, just go back to this list of acronyms here. One example of this is an initiative recently introduced by an august body to which I myself belong, the British Academy, which represents not just the arts, but also the humanities and the social sciences. The British Academy has recently proposed a new acronym of its own. This is SHAPE, S-H-A-P-E here, standing for Social Sciences, Humanities and the Arts for People and Economy. And in introducing SHAPE, the British Academy is seeking to emulate the success of STEM in attracting funding and securing links to government and business. SHAPE, according to the British Academy's website, SHAPE promises to collaborate with STEM, I quote, to make innovation work harder for the benefit of everyone. And again, to bring color, texture, opinion, and perspective to our everyday. But this does nothing to rock the boat. In its offer to leaven the austerity of STEM with empathy, self-expression, and local color, the SHAPE initiative submits to the very forces that have already harnessed the constituent disciplines of STEM in the corporate capture of research and education. Now, I contend that art, including design and architecture, have a far more radical role to play. It is to change the very meaning and purpose of education across every field of study, from the efficient delivery of knowledge products to consumers to an endless journey of discovery on which students and teachers are embarked together, driven not by market-led demand for innovation, but by a passion to seek the truth of what is real and present in the world. Far from opening up a space for the cultivation of subjective self-expression, alongside and as a complement to the space of objective knowledge transfer, this is to bring students into an ongoing dialogue with the world itself, affording them the possibility to attend to the things or beings to be found there, to answer to their presence, and to explore the conditions of coexistence with them. So instead of educating students on the subjects of art, including architecture and design, here it is the practices of art that educate. They do so by opening a path or showing the way, guiding attention towards aspects of the world that might be worthy of closer study. This is to recover the very essence of correspondence, of going along with things and learning from, that is repudiated by the logic of the acronym. The acronym, as we've seen, cuts us off from matters of which we speak, promoting an attitude at once disengaged and manipulative, epitomized in the word smart. The practices of art, architecture, and design I argue, foster precisely the opposite attitude, that is, of enduring attention, responsiveness, and care. Now, arguably, of course, this attitude has always been the hallmark of true scholarship, even in fields that would nowadays come under the rubric of science. It's there in the biologist's attention to living things, in the chemist's attention to the properties of materials, in the physicist's attention to matter itself. Technology and engineering likewise resemble craft in the perceptual acuity and respect for materials required of their practitioners. As for mathematics, the rootedness of mathematical understanding in gesture, rhythm, and trace, and its proximity to the arts of music and dance have been evident since ancient times, notwithstanding the myths of intellectual genius that have grown up around it. For such giants of the past as Vitruvius, Alberti, Leonardo da Vinci, and Constable, founding figures respectively in architecture, perspective, anatomy, and meteorology, science and art were never separate or even separable endeavors, but rather long-standing traditions of inquiry unified in their commitment to careful observation, patient experimentation, precise description, and informed speculation. Indeed, this is how the real sciences and how real scientists have always worked and still work today, feeling their way from within, guided by genuine wonder, curiosity, and care. This calls, however, for an imagination wholly distinct from that of the kind coveted by STEM, or even by STEAM. It is an imagination that, far from closing in on smart solutions, opens up to the world's ceaseless formation, drawing its creative powers from the self-same source. Could the role of the arts, then, be to resituate this kind of imagination at the very heart of education? Well, education is, of course, the means by which a society ensures its future. So the question of the role of the arts and of architecture and of design in education admits of different answers depending on the kinds of future they entail. Now, the logic of STEM, as I've shown, is uncompromising in its repudiation of the past. And without a past, STEM cannot grow into the future. Its claim is rather to be the future, a future virtually upon us, the reality of the present already out of date. That's why the metaphors of choice are state of the art or the cutting edge. Some things, of course, come with a lead time attached of years, perhaps of decades. And yet they are ready to be rolled out, the machinery to realize them up and running. And if the future is ready and waiting, then youngsters must be ready for it, must be prepared for it. And this, according to its rhetoric, is what STEM education is about, preparing the coming generation for a cutthroat world in which only the smart will survive. Nothing seems more important than employability, booking a place in the new technocratic world order. It is an order that promises untold wealth and endless luxury for the few that make it into its glass palaces, while dismissing the remaining inhabitants of a ravaged and depleted planet as surplus to requirements. Anyone deemed unemployable is destined for the scrap heap. And with every passing year, the competition intensifies. As the future comes ever closer, time itself is compressed into the plane of instantaneity. It is the time of now. The shift from STEM to STEAM in its original formulation would supercharge this already hyperbolic futurism. As the Rhode Island School of Design declares in its propaganda, we return to this quotation, the future for which STEAM prepares its students is what they call the 21st century innovation economy. And like athletes practicing for the Olympics, students are to be trained to compete. Success is measured by financial reward. Those, however, who propose adding the arts to STEM on grounds of complementarity take a rather broader view, more wedded to humanistic ideals of progressive enlightenment. Money, they say, isn't everything. In their rhetoric, art provides the means for students, as we say, to fulfill their potential as well-rounded citizens by furnishing the means of self-expression otherwise excluded by the rigor and severity of STEM. In their view, education is above all a vehicle of progress, a means to ensure that every generation betters its predecessors. The future, they say, lies in human self-improvement. And yet, the discourse of fulfillment describes life as a movement towards closure, a gradual filling up of capacities and shutting down of possibilities. The human being who at birth brims with as yet unformed potential ends with this potential exhausted, with nothing further to do than to reflect on past achievements. So the result is a picture of life shaped rather like a bell curve, as in this diagram here, roughly divisible into 3 phases. So here is the course of life. This axis is one of power, this one of age. So there are 3 phases here. There's an initial phase of growth and formation in which the young are readied for a world that awaits them. Then over here, there's a final phase of reversal and decline as capacities fade. And in between, a phase in which human world-forming powers are at their peak. This is what I call the generation of now. Now, in modern societies, this intermediate generation, thrust between youth and old age, between the young and the old, holds all the cards. So busy are its people with the affairs of the day that they pay scant attention to their elders or their juniors. Old people, they think, having already enjoyed their place in the sun, should sink gracefully into obscurity. Their time is past, their days over. Young people, to the contrary, over here, they need to be brought up to speed to face a future already prepared for them. And yet, this model of generational succession is, which is fundamental to the Enlightenment idea of progress, contains an inherent contradiction. For if the present intermediate generation has already made a world for the generation to come, what is left for this coming generation to do? How can it take up the baton of world making, save by either undoing or by overwriting the work of its predecessor? It seems that With every generation, its predecessors' designs for the future must be obliterated, while its successor, in turn, is equally bound to obliterate the future that had been made for it. Indeed, if every future is a prediction, then not only do all predictions fail, they must fail for every generation to have a future it can call its own. There's a striking parallel here with the idea of progress in science, which is likewise supposed to proceed through conjecture and refutation. In science, as in society, progress is founded on a history of predictive failure. Yet this kind of serial replacement of futures conjectured only to be refuted hardly amounts to a formula for sustainable living. Sustaining life means keeping it going, perpetually opening to new beginnings, rather than restarting over and over again on the back of past closures. As we find to our cost, sustainability is incompatible with the doctrine of progressive change. We can't have it both ways. For advocates of the shift from STEM to STEAM on grounds of complementarity, education in the arts is a means to the end of progress. But I want to suggest to the contrary, that only an education turned around by art, including architecture and design, that corresponds with the world, rather than seeking to manipulate it to human advantage, only such an education can further the cause of sustainable living. And this means thinking differently about intergenerational relations. See, modern thought tends to imagine every generation in its active phase as occupying the plane of the present. As it reaches its prime, it layers its own designs and constructions over those of generations past. Each layer establishes its own plane of synchrony, while layer follows layer in diachronic sequence, burying those beneath, much as in an archive, old documents are buried under more recent ones. Renewal, then, can only come from superposition, from adding one layer after another to the stack. But what if instead we were to align successive generations longitudinally, allowing them to overlap and entwine along their length? No one lives forever, but so long as new lives are introduced as old lives pass, life itself can continue without end. This is to liken the passage of generations to a rope rather than a stack. In the rope, each fiber is only so long, but by paying in new fibers as fast as old ones give out, the rope itself winds on indefinitely. Moreover, just as the twist of its overlapping fibers gives the rope its tensile strength, so also in life, it is by carrying on their lives together that the old and the young can lay an assured path for generations to come. Indeed, throughout most of history, this is precisely how human lives have been lived. Youngsters have grown up hearing the stories and observing the practices of their elders, discovering the meanings of the stories and developing the skills of practice in the passage of their own experience, and becoming storytellers and practitioners in their turn. Yet, by and large, this is no longer true today. What happened? When and why did every intermediate generation come to see itself as the generation of now? What fired it with such world-making zeal as to consign the wisdom of its elders to history, while treating its own children as creatures of nature at ground zero of civility, in need of induction into a future that they can have no hand in shaping. Now, answers are not easy to come by. They have much to do with the displacement of domestic modes of production by capitalism and by the transfer of educational functions from the family to the state. But what's certain is that generation now has little time for stories or for skills. These, it says, are the stuff of tradition, preserved only to entertain the young in enactments of heritage or to indulge the old in flights of nostalgia. The intermediate generation, this generation of now, is target-driven. It has its ends and its means. Yet, as its ends expand, fueled by ambitions of growth and development, so its means contract. Its short-term objectives hold no promise that life can endure beyond a future already in its sights. Faced with a looming environmental catastrophe, it has no answer save to dream of a permanent geotechnological fix, or of finding new resource reservoirs on other planets, leaving the bulk of humanity to eke out a living on an irreparably damaged Earth. Every competition has far more losers than winners, and for every individual smart enough to succeed, another million will fail. But a sustainable world cannot be for some but not others, let alone reserved for a select few. It must have room for everyone and everything, not just now, but indefinitely. I contend that there is but one way to bring about such a world, and that is to loosen the grip of the intermediate generation. Can we imagine a society in which young and old, currently excluded from the tasks of world-making, are once again enabled to work alongside one another in forging the conditions of collective life? Can we break the barriers of their institutionalized segregation, allowing them to reassemble in the quotidian settings in which these tasks are typically carried on? This question has massive implications for the way we think about education, about the wisdom of the elderly and the curiosity of the young, and about the potential of their collaboration. For both young children and the elderly are in touch in ways that target-driven intermediates are not, with more enduring rhythms of time. This is a time not of succession and replacement, but of pure becoming or immanence. It's a time of weather and the seasons, of breaking waves and running rivers, of the growth and decay of vegetation and the coming and going of animals, of breaths and heartbeats. We sometimes say of children and of old people, even as we sometimes say of animals, that they live in the present without recollection or forethought. And yet, therein, in every present moment, lies an eternity. It is perhaps because their minds are no longer or not yet cluttered with recollections and predictions that the old and the very young are better able to attend to the world in its immediacy and more ready to be addressed by it. And this readiness opens a way for the imagination. For young and old alike, imagination is not a power of conjecture, allowing for the projection in the terms of the present of a future state of affairs. Nor conversely is memory the recollection of a past already buried. Rather, both imagination and memory coalesce in a beyond that is neither before nor after, but falls in an entirely different register. We could call it the register of longing. To long for things is neither to conjure up the future or to wish back the past. It is rather to align care and attention with the temporal stretch of life. In this care and attentiveness lies both the curiosity of the young and the wisdom of the elderly. Neither juvenile curiosity nor seasoned wisdom, however, hold much esteem in a societal regime that values objective knowledge and the operations of abstract reason above all else. For knowledge, putting answers ahead of questions stamps out curiosity, while reason, privileging cognition over attention, leaves wisdom diminished by comparison. Indeed, within the prevailing value system that underlies our institutions of education and social care, dedicated respectively to preparing children for a predetermined future and sequestering the elderly for whom this future came too late, the innocence of curiosity is assessed as a deficiency of knowledge, and the humility of wisdom is assessed as a deficiency of mind. The first branded as ignorance, the second as dementia. Now, for the generation of now, in command of the present, the idea that the demented and the ignorant might together forge the future would be manifestly absurd. However, to unite wisdom and curiosity seems not only prudent, but necessary for the renewal of life for generations to come. This is not nostalgia or hankering for a lost past, nor is it a utopian fantasy for the future. It is rather a foundation for hope. But to turn hope into reality, old and young must once again come together, making their productive and mutually transformative collaboration into a force of renewal for the common good. Could this collaboration, rather than the unilateral transfer of knowledge from senior to junior generations, be what education is really about? This, I argue, is what it means for education to be turned around by art, by architecture, by design. It is above all in the combination of curiosity and wisdom that the artistic imagination comes into its own. To imagine thus is to answer to the stirring of a restless world, feeling one's way in the twilight with no clear end in sight, lured by what the philosopher John Dewey in his essay on Art as Experienced described as an aura, dimly and imprecisely figured. And yet, as Dewey acknowledged, this kind of imagination is by no means limited to art or even to architecture or to design. It is common, he said, to thinkers of all professions, be they poets or painters, scientists or philosophers, or we could add technologists, engineers, or mathematicians. All are driven by a compelling sense of longing, even though none can say exactly what they long for. Indeed, once the ends are known, once they come within reach of conceptual representation, all imagination ceases, and all remembering too. For longing can never be requited. Its potential must ever remain unfulfilled. There is no final release into the light. But for just this reason, longing is the guarantor that life can continue, that the aura of the future, receding in step with our advance, will never cease to beckon from beyond the horizons of conceptualization. We thus arrive in conclusion at the very antithesis of STEAM, Instead of including education in art, architecture, and design, instead of including education in art, architecture, and design within a truncated compaction of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics that cuts across their respective traditions of endeavor, we have gathered all these traditions within an encompassing conception of education as the work of art. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your compelling presentation, Professor Ingold. The lecture has made us critically question and re-examine the futures that we are heading towards, and has thereby deepened our understanding of the role of architecture and even our role as the young generation. We would now like to invite Professor Chhaya to commence the discussion. Professor Neelkanth Chhaya has been an academic and practicing architect for nearly 40 years. He taught for 26 years at CEPT University Ahmedabad, from where he retired as the Dean of Faculty of Architecture in 2013. Since 2015, he has been an adjunct faculty at Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. He currently holds the UNESCO Chair in Culture, Habitat, Sustainable Development at Srishti. We would like to welcome him to the stage. We encourage the audience to write their curiosities and questions on the paper being passed, and we'll take them up at the end of the discussion. Thank you.
This feels very strange looking at you on this screen and then having you looking at me from behind. It's something like what you have been talking about in a way. If you would allow, just a little bit on the lighter side first. This word CEPT, its history is very interesting. Before it became CEPT University, which they say is in 2005, but in 1972, the School of Planning was set up after the School of Architecture. That I was a student in architecture at that time. And I must admit that we hated the subject of planning. It was control freaks using managerial techniques, if I might say. So I'm sorry, there must be so many planners in the audience. But the name CEPT came from a sort of accidental thing. You see, the School of Architecture had a telegraphic address. I'm sure you remember the times when there were telegrams, and you used to have a telegraphic address to reduce the word count for those who wanted to send you something. So the telegraphic address, when I joined the school, was concept. And somebody realized that if you cut the con out of it, then you can include the planners and ultimately the technologists. And that's how that acronym came. Somebody was clever enough to take that CEPT. But I think your suggestion of CEPT is excellent. And we'll try and see if we can convince the president to go on. You talked about names. There's an essay of Ramchandra Gandhi. Ramchandra Gandhi was a very wonderful philosopher. And the title of the essay is On Naming, On Addressing. On Addressing. And he says that when I say Tim, our subjectivities, mine and yours, immediately come into existence. Till then, we might as well be objective about each other. he's a professor of something, etc., etc. But the moment I say Tim, our subjectivities come to play. And this question, I think you have started your talk most wonderfully with this whole technique which has been worked out to stifle us, to stifle our minds. And this, of course, is in universities everywhere now, and formats after formats, which you have to fill in with great rigor to ensure transparency, which is actually opacity. This is what is there. So I would like now straight away to jump. Yes, one thing I'd like to say, wonderfully, you have brought the neoliberal into the subject of education and what the neoliberal outlook is doing to education. And I think that is perfectly in line with the forum's objectives this year. Their initial statement deals with that. And I must also tell you that your lecture was, I don't know, today they announced it as the keynote lecture, but the lecture is originally titled the Kurula Varki Memorial Lecture. And Kurula, sitting up there, wherever he is, he probably has enjoyed your talk as much as I have. He was my teacher. So let's start talking about attention and responsiveness. And you said science and art were never separate. And that reminded me of the fact that Darcy Thompson, in his book on growth and form, was such an inspiration to everybody on campus, because there were drawings of crystals, there were drawings of single-celled animals, then there were drawings of fish which were transformed, and everything, mathematics, science, chemistry, biology, all of that to the architect, because it was all about the wonder of form. Can you talk a little bit about how attention is something which is the basis for the attention to the world as it comes into being? Attention. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because you've said in your books, you've said some wonderful things about it. So maybe now, the only thing I remember is your talk about how when we walk, if we have shoes on of a particular kind, and we forget where we are walking and who we are. So maybe you'll talk about attention with some kind of examples. That would be nice. Which is also connected to responsiveness, of course, and care. You're muted.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be talking with you, and also slightly surreal for me, because I can see in the image I have of your head and shoulders and the microphone, in the background is an image of the screen, and on the image of the screen is displayed the books that are on my and files that are on my shelf just behind my shoulder. So I'm seeing files reflected via Ahmedabad, via India, back into my sitting room. So it's a very strange world that we're living in. But yeah, I'm happy to say more about attention. I do think that this is a absolutely critical concept, and maybe the place to start with it is in terms of the distinction I see between knowledge and wisdom. Because mainstream education sees its purpose I started providing students with the knowledge they need to be able to cope with the world around them. It gives them, it's like a suit of armor that gives them, and gives them the means of defense and attack to cope with the world outside. And whereas wisdom is rather like a process of disarmament, of taking all your armor off, of laying down all your weapons, which makes you very vulnerable. But because you're vulnerable to the world around, you also pay very close attention to things. So we're in this curious situation where, in fact, we know too much. We are provided with so much knowledge that we are unable to attend to what is actually there. And since we cannot attend to what is there, because we just see our own knowledge rather than the thing itself, because we cannot attend to things, we're unable to respond to them. Because you can't respond to anything unless you first pay attention to it. So I'm not suggesting that we can do without knowledge, or that education simply can forget about knowledge. I think it's a matter of getting the balance right.
Yes.
Of saying that certainly students need to know things. There are important things that we have to know in order to manage in this world, but knowledge isn't everything. And we have to be able to see things for what they are and attend to them and look after them as well. And it's getting that balance, I think, that it's such a problem.
So it also means perhaps that we cannot wall in the place of learning and collect all the knowledge there which you sort of consume and your bodies are full of it, and then you go out. What you're suggesting is that the world permeates. The young permeate, the old permeate, the trees, the animals, the landscapes, the weather, all of that permeates this place of learning.
Absolutely. So the world itself is our place of education.
And I like to imagine that perhaps the world is also looking at the way in which I respond.
Yes.
Ways. At least a cow does at times. But
animals certainly do. They're keeping an eye on us as we're keeping an eye on them.
Yes. So maybe this question of care takes away the question of time, takes away the question of shortage of time and the calendar in which the learning has to happen.
This problem of time is really, really difficult. I've been losing sleep in the last 2 nights because I need to write something about the architectural imagination of the future. And so I've been worrying about the future and the past. And here's this thing that's been worrying me about what we mean by before and after. Before can mean everything that's in front of you, and after everything that is behind. So before is the future, and after is the past. And yet we often say, oh, that's what happened before, that was in the past, and after, that's what's happening in the future. So something is flipping before and after around. Yes. And I'm trying to figure out what it is and what it would take to flip it back again. But at the moment, I still haven't quite worked this out, so I can't explain it any more clearly.
Your image of the braided rope was a very good one that way. And it reminded me, I don't know whether others have played with this, but when I was a child, I was given an old discarded reel on which thread had come, and 4 nails were put on it on one side, and you tied string, which came in rolls like that, And then you kept on putting it over one nail and the other, and you pulled it through, pulled it through. So all the time you were creating a rope which was consuming something which was right there in the present, but the rope was also there in the present. And this reel with the hole through it was the only thing which was perhaps the present. And
that's a lovely image, but here's another one that I've been thinking about, because sometimes people compare the passage of time to spinning. So you're spinning a thread, right, with a spindle, and recently I'd never spun before, but recently I was taught how to spin thread with a hand spindle, and I realized I always imagined a drop spindle, the sort that just hangs like that, and I'd always imagined that as you spin thread, it just sort of winds on, but I discovered that it's just the opposite. That when you spin the spindle, then the thread winds up the way you're holding it. Then you have to roll it on the spindle, then wind up again. So that if you compared the passage of time to spinning a thread, it doesn't just go on in a linear way, it actually goes backwards.
Yes.
And time then becomes an accumulation of backward movements. And I still try to work that out. It's a bit the same with an old-fashioned clock, the way a ratchet and a spring works.
Yes.
But I'm still thinking about that.
That's perhaps why Gandhi was so interested in spinning, because
maybe, yes.
The future was, of course, there, and it could be whatever it was, but this present in which the spinning was happening, and the humming of the spinning wheel, and all the things that happen that you sing with it, and it sort of created a tension of a different kind, because you stepped out of the concern for the future or the concern for the product that came afterwards. And I think this key point that you made, that the obsession with the product really distorts our imagination. It makes, so now you said education is the work of art. Can you talk about that a little bit more? How art...
Yes, actually that idea came to me a few years ago when I was talking with a group of people who were thinking about how to bring art into schools. And it suddenly occurred to me as I was talking with these people, both academics in a department, but that why couldn't we regard the school itself as a collective work of art? And they were talking about primary schools for young kids, sort of aged between 5 and 11, young children. A school that is situated in the heart of a community where parents are bringing their children every day to the school gate and then picking them up again. So there it is in the middle of the community, belongs to everybody. All this work is going on in the school, where the teachers and the children are working together in creating all kinds of stuff and talking about life and finding out about things. What if we regarded that whole thing, that whole setup, as a work of art, a collective work of art that is continually being created, it's never finished, but so instead of saying, oh, art is one of those subjects you do in school, along with maths and biology and the rest of it, what if we actually said, no, actually, that is the work of art?
Yes.
And it's that idea that was still not around, knocking around in my head.
Yes. So in my mind, it brings up an idea of a school of architecture as a place which is one, the venue in the city also feel free to come in. It's connected to the landscapes around the city, and the students go in and out, and the farmers come in, and there is some growing also happening, and there is some And it might be that there is music being learned somewhere near, very near. There might be some painting going on. There might be sculpture going on. There might be science. But together, then the School of Architecture becomes part of this work of art that you're talking about. That it is a community which is interested in seeing that the sense of wonder is nourished all the time, and that out of that comes the growth of whatever is the thing. Yes.
That's exactly it, and I think this the idea was behind a lot of the Bauhaus. When the Bauhaus was set up, I think they had very much that same kind of idea. They of course linked up with Tagore in India, and I think there was a sort of an Indian Bauhaus movement as well. I don't know too much about it, but
yes,
but it's not a new idea.
No, it's not at all a new idea. In fact, in the 19th century in France, there was a school of agritecture. Because the slogan was both the farmer and the architect attend to the land.
And I believe now that it's really important to reintegrate education in architecture and education in agriculture. We have to bring them together, because we have to recognize that buildings are places not only where people live and work, but where food is grown. And that's the only way in which we can break down the long supply chains, the globalization of food production and all the rest of it.
And then it's no longer a decorative greening of the building, but it's actually a living phenomenon of making, eating, and so on.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know how we are doing for time. Are we, will we go to the questions now, do you think? Yes? Tim, I think we'll look at some questions. This conversation will continue.
Yes, it's been a pleasure, yeah.
And, well, it's raining here. I suppose it's summer in Scotland, no?
We've had the south of Britain has had a severe drought, like much of Europe.
Yes,
It's been very an unusually warm summer, but now it's beginning to cool down here in Scotland. There were it's about 18 degrees, I think.
Wonderful.
And sunny, yeah, very pleasant.
We have something like 35 degrees and lots.
Oh, I wouldn't survive in that.
Take the questions on, and you can continue with that. Thank you, Tim.
Okay.
Thank you, Chhaya sir and Professor Ingold, for that compelling discussion. We will begin taking questions from the audience. We invite our panelist, Professor Helene, on the podium to ask her questions.
Good evening, Tim. I guess it's evening. I'm not sure.
Oh, it's just after lunch here.
Okay. Oh, we're ahead of you. My name's Hélène Frichot. I'm based at the University of Melbourne and was previously based at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And very much appreciated your talk. I believe you come and talked at Konstfack before, perhaps in Stockholm. And unfortunately, I missed that talk, but heard great things about it. I very much enjoyed your lecture tonight, and I think it's extremely topical how we need to really radically rethink education in design schools. It's a big and challenging project in Sweden, in Australia, in many of the places I've been, found myself a teacher. I had a couple of quite specific questions for you. I wasn't realizing I was going to stand up at the podium and ask them. But I was interested in your reference to affect, such as, for example, this idea of affective embodied expression. And I myself have been involved somewhat in contributing to what has come to be called affect theory, which has been developing in an interesting way as a theoretical domain. And so I guess I was interested in the connection between your work and affect theory, and whether you could expand a bit more on affect in relation to what you're discussing today.
Okay. I know you've been involved in affect theory, and there is this whole body of literature that's coming out at the moment around that. I myself, I find the term affect extremely helpful, but at the same time, I don't want to get too hooked on it, because I worry that it's actually becoming a little bit overdone and in danger of losing its power. I got to it, I think, from wanting to think about feeling, and feeling not as something you experience on the inside, as you might if you're a psychologist of the emotions. You'd say you've got some sort of inner mental state or something like that, but rather feeling as something you do, which involves a direct haptic engagement with whatever it is that you're feeling, so that it's relational, it's active, and it's perceptual. And the word affect, which in a way is like a noun that ought to be a verb, stands in quite well for that sense of a direct perceptual involvement that is rooted in the active relation between you and something else in the world. And so that's what I mean by affect. I think that's why the concept is important, but I'm a little bit wary of reifying it, of making it into too much of a thing, because I think then we might risk once it sort of takes over and becomes this thing in its own right, we might risk losing its original power. And that happens with all kinds of theoretical buzzwords, and one has to be careful of that.
Always the risk of our concepts, for sure, when it's
taking over.
Yeah. I had one more question, if that's okay. You speak a lot about the importance of reclaiming that embodied position and acknowledging subjectivity, which comes very much also into your comments on attention and care and sort of relationality at work here. And this, of course, strikes me as very much being part of a tradition of feminist thinking and philosophy, whether it's through standpoint theories or Donna Haraway's situated knowledges, where the researcher is, encouraged to sort of acknowledge the situation they find themselves within. And so I was wondering whether you found any use in feminist philosophies in your work.
This is a tricky one. Of course I do. But the thing is that I've come into much of this philosophy sometime before it was appropriated by feminism. So for example, back in the early 1980s, I was reading Bergson and Whitehead, and I was completely blown away by Bergson. I thought, this guy saying everything I've been trying to say. That was in 1982, I think, when I first picked back Bergson's work, more or less by mistake. And I was telling my philosophical friends at the University of Manchester about this, and they kind of went white in the face and said, it's all very well for you, but we're philosophers and we have our careers to think about, and you don't start talking about discredited characters like Bergson, because at those days it was completely out of fashion. Now it's come right back in again, and has been brought, and Deleuze brought it in, and all sorts of other things. And Whitehead was never quite such a big, he's so difficult to understand, but I was reading him as well. And so all of this kind of processual, relational thinking was sort of part of I was in here already. And then I suddenly found that I was supposed to call this feminist. I thought, why? I'm not a woman, and these guys like Whitehead wasn't a woman, and Bergson's not a woman, and I can perfectly well see the reasons why, that there's there's a rhetorical purpose and a perfectly legitimate one for that feminist theorists. So in anthropology, I come from, so Marilyn Strathern has been doing a lot of that, but there are plenty of other people have had an important job to do, and they've done it very well, and I don't object to that. But I'm not sure myself whether it's altogether helpful to sweep the whole lot of process ontology into the feminist bucket, because that doesn't need to be there. I would put feminism inside process ontology rather than process ontology inside feminism. Maybe I could put it like that.
Thank you for your very generous answers.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would like to invite Professor Sonal Mittal to ask her question.
Thank you, GVDF, for organizing this lecture, and thank you, Professor Thames. It was a pleasure as well as an honor to listen to you. My first question is coming from this very fascinating start to this question of education that you gave, and you started with acronyms. And this is the first time I realized how bureaucratic and managerial those acronyms are. So, I mean, there is in the acronyms, there is like a very powerful way of, defining territories and defining like what each, what is, what arts is, or what technology is, and defining those boundaries is very deeply, it's very formal in that sense. So my question was within the acronym, and you can choose like howsoever you want to answer this question. Like, in the acronyms, there is this letters that are placed together, but there is some space between that letters, and sometimes we put a period mark or something. So what is the value of the space between those letters, which allows for that, room to, there's a word that will resist the boundary, or the boundary gets fuzzed or something like that. So that is my question, like the education to reinvent itself from within those spaces, which are not defined by hegemonies, but from within itself, and from maybe the students, from the importance. Yeah.
Actually, that's a lovely question, because it not only makes me think of the spaces. You could argue, I think, that it's precisely from out of those spaces that real education comes. In other words, it's not, say, taking STEM, for example, it's not science or technology or engineering or mathematics. It's not in the letters. It's in those, and it's not even in an interdisciplinary sort of thing. It's more in an indefined space. And the analogy I would use here is, I like this analogy of a river flowing between its banks. Okay, imagine that on one side of the bank is one letter, like S, and on the other side of the bank is another one, say T, so science, technology. But then you think, do you build a bridge across the river to connect science and technology? Or do you say, no, we get into the river itself and go with the water? And the water which is running under the bridge is not going from one to the other, it's going orthogonally to that. It's flowing along, it's not going from anywhere to anywhere, but it's carrying on. And that the real impulse of education, I think what I would be wanting to argue is that it's actually going with the river rather than connecting up from one bank to the other.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly, I think, what you mean by the space between the terms. But I could add one other thing, and that is that you could focus on the letters themselves and think how interesting these letters are, because every letter is in an alphabetical script, and we don't get into problems with some Chinese or calligraphic script. It's in a different world. But even if you to focus on the letters, I'm fascinated by the idea, for example, whenever I write the letter A, you think that my hand sort of knows how to write it, and yet over thousands of years, people have been writing this letter, and it has gradually changed from its original form, which is a pictogram for the head of an ox in ancient Egypt, through to the kind of letter we draw today, through all kinds of variations. And it's just amazing to think about the letter itself, which of course we don't do at all when we normally use an acronym.
Absolutely. And I just had one more question that I thought of from the later part. And it's again, like, following up on Helen's question as well. So you do talk about vulnerabilities, acknowledging vulnerabilities when we talk about, attention and responsiveness. And that is to acknowledge vulnerabilities. So looking at it from the education question and the role of the educators, how much value do you place to bringing your own vulnerabilities as an educator to the learning environment? Like, we are acknowledging the ability to acknowledge our vulnerabilities and how valuable that is in a learning and teaching learning environment.
I mean, surely I think that we are professionally as educators, we are taught, even trained, to hide any feelings of vulnerability or any sense where we feel exposed, to somehow try and cover it up, and then release it only outside the schools where no one else can notice it. And maybe students are also told that they've got to try and do the same, and sometimes they find it difficult, and this seems to me probably not the best approach, because and perhaps one way to think about this is to think of vulnerability as something that can be positive as well as negative. I mean, let's say that we tend to think about vulnerability as a kind of weakness, and then we tend to think of weakness as opposed to strength, and that strength is good and weakness is bad. But actually, it could be the other way around. That strength can be sometimes a very negative thing, and weakness can be a very positive thing, precisely because it enhances attentiveness and some sort of sensibility. So I've come across this too in anthropology, talking about so-called indigenous peoples. I mean, one of the things that's often said about indigenous peoples is that they are very vulnerable, as indeed they are, to state power and that kind of thing, or outside in commercial interests. But for them, that vulnerability is a profound source of wisdom, and it therefore is something that is considered to be a social good rather than a harm. So I think there is room to think about vulnerability. Perhaps we need a different word that wouldn't lead us to think about it in a negative way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what my takeaway from this, what you're saying, is that vulnerability allows for us to empathize with other people, and so we are able to, as educators, we are able to access what would be the a push for a certain student, things like. And I'm just simplifying it, but maybe vulnerability, acknowledging our own vulnerability to ourselves, allows us to make a little bit more inclusive environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for indulging me. Thanks.
Thank you all for all your questions. We're sorry we're running out of time, so we won't be able to take up all the questions. Keeping these conversations in mind, we would like to conclude this session
with the short film that all of us students prepared. This documentary intends to perpetuate the students' thoughts on diverse processes, learnings, and the forum itself. Sir, we would be grateful to you if you could stay in for the documentary. We are sure these conversations are going to stay with you.
So, let's talk about processes. Is process a common thread of our profession that needs to be addressed and discussed? What are the defaults and assumptions that we consider for granted while designing? Are we conscious about it? And what are the processes that we follow? Hey, there's a box, let's look into it. It says processes. A design process is never linear, but a series of back and forths as you meander through the tangle of thoughts and ideas. Slowly and patiently, you explore and decode this riddle, coming out with a new outcome and learning each time. Is process singular, or is it the collaboration and team effort that loosens every knot and twist to investigate the possibilities of design? Design is, thus, a creative process perceived differently across individuals. Even with the same context, our choices, interpretations, and methods of decoding allow a multitude of explorations.
I would like to call myself an architect. I would like to, if I get the freedom, I would like to call myself a space director. So really designing something, resolving a plan or resolving a detail or thinking about a joinery, even in furniture, thinking about a form or trying to develop a form function combination. Sketching, of course, then there is a depth in it. Now this thing can only come through scribbling. Like, having a tracing paper and trying to just work on it, that, how am I going to make this? And then there is a big step here. Detailing, that's my go-to medium, and I design building elements and then I try to use them to design spaces.
Thinking process, I still feel that, that connection with hand is very important for me personally. And so I need to visualize it with my hand on paper and then, connect.
Tool, it's a methodology which I always use, and it's called go along methodology, which is mainly used in anthropological studies. But then if we apply it to architectural study, then I think the true aspirations and the needs, what we can get, that can drive the whole design process. So that will be the focus, that a go along method can really bring the true insights. Yeah, so in the go along method, what happens is you don't ask people with whom you are meeting to a particular time or a place, but then you join them in the daily course. So what you do is that if you are going to meet someone, then whatever they are doing it in their daily activity, you just join that activity, and in that activity you just start having a conversation. And in that conversations, you will put your thoughts behind it, that like you will put your framework, so that you will be able to get the thoughts and what is the reason behind those thoughts. Because if you will be sit with that questioner and you will ask this question, then they will become very conscious, and then whatever they are feeling true will not come out.
I would not even think of Miro. I would still want to sit on the table look at each other's expressions, because it's a matter of collaboration. I want to see if I'm drawing this line, how's your reaction? Are you saying that's not good? Okay, maybe think of another quick expression. So I feel a very different tangent to designing, but if you are sitting in a collaborative table, why am I designing with you? It's because I want your opinion as well. It's a matter of collaboration. So it's about quick reaction and then changes.
The entire design is a small portion. If we discuss part and whole kind of theory, design theory, then it is always that we lack is the part of it. The whole will be coming out really well because it's one idea that we are executing. But when it comes to the part detail and the part of the entire design, that's where we would like to give.
Having more time results in a better design. So I have two projects. I recently completed a project in 10 months with architecture, interiors, foundation, everything. And the other project took me 4 years. So there were two extremes for me. And that 4-year project, so I remember when I went to Villa Sarabai, I asked the guy, okay, how much time did it take to, because I saw certain details which were so sensitive in terms of, the care with which, that can only happen through time. And he said 1951 to 1954 or something like that. And I'm like, okay.
Because the people involved in it, the site is different. I am different from last time. Working with a master craftsman versus if I'm working with a craftsman who has as much experience as I do, I will work very differently. I will make very different kind of works. Relationship to that craftsman is going to be different, and his relationship to his work is different. And so my understanding of what that project is going to be has to change.
That unless and until you take all the stakeholders on board, okay, there is no definitive design idea. With each discussion, the design idea evolves. There will be primary design factors or framework. That framework happens. All of this through quick sketches, layering, tracing, paper tracing, what you're talking about, the go-to medium. Medium for me is always paper and pen or pencil.
To drive the design process is the people and the challenging of the places. And then you will add your experiences and you will bring that, like, okay, I have tried these elements, I have tried this, putting these two elements together, let me try here in another way. So then I'll not have to be conscious that, oh, am I repeating or not? Am I creating a signature or not? This is not my style.
We start pinpointing random rooms and corners, and then we say that, how can we make this better? How can we make this better? And then for that specific thing, we take it as a time problem or like a design problem, and we solve it in different ways which we think will help it better, like model making, or we maybe Photoshop materials in it, we sketch it out, or we get 3D done. So instead of the whole process changing, I still prefer a linear method, and then picking and pulling up things which I feel needs work, and then inserting a new method in it.
Process is not just exclusive to architecture, but exists all around us. Look at the potter's hands, for instance. The remarkable dexterity and mastery their hands have learned over the years. With time, the muscles learn the natural sense of pushing the clay just right, and the hands learn the subtle dance with the wheel. The intensive process of wood block making begins from tracing intricate designs onto the wood to deftly carving with chisels and drills. The pressure and angle maintained while chiseling determines the quality of the wood block, while it is the logical process of carving out the negative areas wherein the positive surfaces form the complex design motif. The process of thatch making is a collaborative practice where they use the physical strength of their hands and feet to roll mud and tie the thatch. Wooden roofs, on the other hand, require a physical effort in arms for sawing and drilling the grooves in the wood and collectively seeing it come as one element later. The making of terrazzo tiles is a handmade process requiring exceptional craft and coherence in design. Innovative patterns are designed after which their sturdy metal frame of correct form and depth is prepared. A pigmented mixture of ground minerals is poured carefully into the module, which are innovative blends of colors, aggregates, and textures. A mixture of cement and sand is filled onto this mixture, and the frame is agitated to fill any existing air gaps. Practices like Abari encourage the local communities to construct their own homes using natural breathing materials, earth and bamboo. They are taught from Abari's open source manuals, which provides a step-by-step detailed process of construction ranging from various methods of tying joineries to the know-how of building techniques regarding various materials with context to the climate and site. It focuses on greater site engagement with the locals, empowering them to be the makers of their own homes. Another step towards designing for the community is the construction of low-cost housing in the rural areas of India. But what could be the best possible approach to designing such a project? By using the easily available materials around and solar panels as roofs, the low-cost housing module is able to produce more energy than required for its construction, thus becoming a self-financing and carbon-negative home for the homeless, which can be built in any site context following the same construction techniques. The RED Studio aims to blur the boundaries between art, architecture, and design. Their process of designing takes inspiration from constructivist art, enabling visual culture to form the basis of design. The significance of responding to a site extends beyond connecting it with the landscape and built environment. Some design processes look at the social aspect of design, wherein the project here focuses on the social integration of impoverished communities through a visually inviting connection to the urban areas, building connections to the major site features like railways, rivers, and bridges, and also designing according to the possible disaster risks. The concept of this design revolves around the functioning of the human body to design a hypermobility center. The nervous system of the body is studied and its connective tissues are abstracted to derive a flow plan. The design evolves from the combination and extrusion of these abstracted tissues to create a sense of realization of how the body functions through movement in the space. Choice of mediums plays a pivotal role in the exploration process of design. Here, charcoal as a medium helps the students to decode the character of the spaces by studying the play of light and shadow, the depth and language of the wall and openings, while texture and materiality of the surroundings is understood via this medium, which aids the design process.
Best part about KVDF is definitely how the entire campus, especially FA, is not on their desks on those days. They're all coming together and organizing that, how the theme is divided into various panels, and the panelists who are coming as well, they make the discussion so rich, and simply because they're coming from different places, I think it's a very refreshing take on most of the topics that are discussed.
KVDF is a platform organized completely by the students and for the students. The whole energy of all the students coming together and putting up the event is what I greatly enjoy.
KVDF to me is an opportunity to get to know more architects, what is going on around the world in terms of a design field.
It starts when people start discussing about anything related to it, to formulating it and the whole process, the dynamic nature of what we call the Kurulavarki Design Forum. The moment we start discussing it and it enters our studios, it enters our minds, I think that's where KVDF started.
We usually don't hear the sole perspective of students on the education that they are undergoing, and it becomes important to know how they perceive the pedagogical shifts that are transforming the way they perceive the environment and the way they practice.
The entire span of academics, we always have questions regarding the pedagogy and practice of architecture. Where is it heading towards? The role of architect in society, etc. So KVDF is a platform for me which allows me a search towards those unanswered questions.
KVDF to me is about connecting us to the architectural world outside of our university.
We now inaugurate the forum. The discussions will happen in the form of 3 sessions over the next 2 days. We invite you to join us for the exhibition of the 15 Theses project in the Sagra basement, which will be followed by dinner in the CFP basement. We would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the coming days as well. Thank you, sir, for this compelling lecture, and we hope that you could be here with us.
Thank you very much. Bye.